In the dead of night, a car sits abandoned on a quiet country road. Its engine hums, the headlights pierce through the fog, and the door swings wide open, but there's no sign of 23-year-old Margaret Walker. That night, in Brooksville, Ohio, one of the town's most beloved teachers vanished without a trace, leaving behind only confusion, unanswered questions, and a community on edge. What happened to Margaret, and why would her killer stay hidden for decades? The confession came 30 years too late. A man sat across from Detective Carl Jenkins in 1987, his hands shaking, his voice barely above a whisper. "I killed her," he said. "I've been living with it every day since." Jenkins didn't move, didn't blink. He had waited decades for this moment, but now that it was here, it felt surreal. Margaret Walker's case, the one that had haunted Brooksville for 3 decades, was about to be solved by the last person anyone suspected. But here's what nobody knew yet. Ralph wasn't alone that night, and the person who helped him hide the body had been sitting in church every Sunday, shaking hands with Margaret's family, pretending to mourn alongside them. The betrayal went deeper than anyone imagined. Before we dive into the investigation, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. You won't want to miss the shocking twists we're about to uncover. Stay with us to see if you can solve this case before we reveal the truth. Now let's go back to where it all began, November 16th, 1957. The night everything changed. Brooksville, Ohio was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. Cornfields stretched for miles in every direction. Main Street had 3 shops, 1 diner, and a church with a white steeple that could be seen from anywhere in town. It was quiet, safe, the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked and trusted their neighbors. Margaret Walker embodied everything good about Brooksville. At 23, she taught 2nd grade at the local elementary school. Kids adored her. Parents respected her. She had a smile that could light up a room and a laugh that made people feel like everything would be okay. She was the youngest of 3 siblings, close to her family, especially her older sister Linda. They spoke every day, shared secrets, made plans for the future. Margaret talked about getting married someday, maybe having children of her own. Her life was just beginning. On November 16th, 1957, Margaret attended a farm party at the Thompson family home. These gatherings were common in Brooksville, neighbors coming together to celebrate the harvest, share food, and enjoy each other's company. Nothing unusual, nothing dangerous. Margaret arrived around 8 o'clock. She wore a blue dress and a cardigan sweater. She laughed with friends, danced a little, ate pie. By all accounts, she had a wonderful time. When midnight approached, she said her goodbyes, hugged a few people, and walked to her car. At least 7 people watched her leave. She waved. She smiled. Her car disappeared down the dark country road. That was the last time anyone in Brooksville saw Margaret Walker alive. It was 2 a.m. when a passing truck driver spotted the sedan on Highway 47, just 3 miles outside town. He slowed down, expecting to find someone changing a tire or dealing with engine trouble. Instead, he found emptiness. The car door swung wide open, engine still running, headlights cutting through November fog, but no Margaret. He flagged down the next vehicle. Within minutes, a local farmer arrived, then another. By the time Sheriff Frank Thompson reached the scene at 2:47 a.m., a small crowd had gathered, their breath forming clouds in the cold air. No one touched anything. They all knew something was deeply wrong. Thompson circled the car slowly, his flashlight beam sweeping across the interior. No blood, no signs of a struggle. The door had been left wide open, but nothing inside suggested panic or violence. Margaret's coat lay folded on the back seat. Her purse sat on the passenger side. $23 inside, her driver's license, a tube of lipstick. Everything looked normal except for the fact that she was gone. The sheriff radioed his deputy. "Get everyone you can. We need to start searching now." By dawn, over 200 people had joined the search. Farmers left their morning chores, shopkeepers closed their stores, teachers from Margaret's school arrived in groups, their faces pale with worry. They spread out across the fields, through the woods, along the creek beds. Flashlights bobbed through the darkness, voices calling her name into the void. Linda Walker arrived at the scene just after sunrise. She stood beside the car, staring at the open door as if willing her sister to materialize. Her hands trembled as she reached out to touch the hood, still faintly warm from the engine that had run for hours before someone finally shut it off. "She was supposed to come straight home," Linda whispered. "She promised." Imagine the panic you'd feel if someone you loved disappeared without a trace. What do you think happened to Margaret? Comment below and share your theories. Detective Carl Jenkins arrived from the county seat that afternoon. He was a quiet man with sharp eyes and a reputation for solving cases that others had given up on. He walked the scene methodically, measuring distances, taking notes, asking questions that made people uncomfortable. "Who saw her leave?" Jenkins asked the group gathered at the Thompson house. Hands went up, voices overlapped. "I did. She left alone." "No, wait. I think I saw someone talking to her by the car." "Was it a man?" "I'm not sure." "Maybe." Jenkins wrote everything down, but the stories didn't align. Some said she left at 11:45. Others insisted it was past midnight. One woman claimed she saw Margaret's car heading north. Another swore it was going south. The detective returned to the abandoned vehicle. He crouched beside the driver's door, studying the ground. The dirt shoulder showed tire marks, but nothing unusual. No skid marks. No evidence of another vehicle forcing her off the road. It was as if she had simply pulled over, opened the door, and stepped out into the night. But why? Jenkins stood and looked down the empty highway. The nearest house was half a mile away. No streetlights, no gas stations. Just darkness and fields stretching in every direction. If Margaret had needed help, there was nowhere to go. The search continued for 3 days. Volunteers walked grid patterns through cornfields, their feet crunching through frost-covered stalks. Divers checked the creek. Tracking dogs followed scents that led nowhere. The state police brought in a helicopter, its rotors thundering overhead as it scanned the landscape below. Nothing. By the 4th day, exhaustion set in. People returned to their homes, their hope fading with each passing hour. The case was no longer a search and rescue operation. It had become something else entirely. Jenkins sat in his makeshift office at the sheriff's station, surrounded by witness statements and maps marked with red circles. He rubbed his eyes, fighting off sleep. The details gnawed at him. The open door, the running engine, the purse left behind. If someone had taken her by force, why leave her belongings? If she had run away, why abandon her car in the middle of nowhere? If she had been in an accident, where was the evidence? The detective leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. Somewhere in this small town, someone knew something. Someone had seen something. But who? Jenkins picked up the phone and called the Thompson house again. He needed to interview everyone who had been at that party, not just about what they saw, but about who Margaret was, who she knew, who might have wanted to harm her. Because one thing was becoming clear. Margaret Walker didn't just disappear. Someone made her disappear, and that someone was still out there, walking the same streets, shopping at the same stores, attending the same church services, pretending to care while hiding the darkest secret Brooksville had ever known. By morning, the search for Margaret was already in full force. Volunteers scoured the woods and fields, but there was no sign of her. Sheriff Frank Thompson and Detective Carl Jenkins began questioning witnesses, but no one had any answers. The sun rose over Brooksville on November 17, 1957, casting long shadows across the search parties that had formed throughout the night. Men in heavy coats walked shoulder to shoulder through cornfields, their boots crushing dried stalks beneath them. Women from the church organized food and coffee at makeshift stations. Children were kept home from school, their parents too afraid to let them out of sight. Margaret's face was everywhere. Flyers appeared on telephone poles in shop windows at the post office. Her school photograph, smiling, hopeful, young, stared out at a town that couldn't comprehend how one of their own had simply vanished. Linda Walker hadn't slept. She moved through the search efforts like a ghost, her eyes red and hollow. Every time someone shouted, she would run toward the sound, heart pounding, praying they had found something, anything. But each time, it was just another false alarm. A piece of fabric that wasn't Margaret's dress, a footprint that led nowhere. She wouldn't just leave, Linda told Sheriff Thompson for the third time that day. You have to understand. Margaret wouldn't do this to us. Something happened to her. Thompson nodded, but his expression betrayed his growing concern. In his 20 years as sheriff, he had never dealt with anything like this. Brooksville didn't have disappearances. They had the occasional bar fight, some livestock theft, maybe a drunk driver now and then. But this was different. Detective Jenkins arrived at the Thompson farm that afternoon to begin formal interviews. He set up in the family's living room, speaking to each party guest one by one. His notebook filled with names, times, observations, but the more people he talked to, the less clear the picture became. Margaret left around midnight, said one guest. No, it was earlier, maybe 11:30, said another. I saw her talking to someone by her car. Who? I don't know. A man, I think. Or maybe it was another woman. It was dark. Jenkins pressed for details, but memories were already becoming unreliable. People remembered what they wanted to remember, or what they thought they should remember. The truth was buried somewhere in the contradictions. One detail, however, kept coming up. Ralph Haynes had been at the party. Several people mentioned seeing him there, though no one could pinpoint exactly when he arrived or when he left. Ralph was a local businessman, respected in the community. He owned a hardware store on Main Street and served on the church board. He was married to Marie, a quiet woman who kept mostly to herself. When Jenkins asked about Ralph's whereabouts that night, the answers were vague. I think he was there early in the evening. Did you see him leave? No, but I wasn't really paying attention. Jenkins made a note. Ralph Haynes. He would need to speak with him directly. The search continued through the second day. Bloodhounds were brought in from the county, their handlers guiding them along Highway 47 where Margaret's car had been found. The dogs picked up a scent near the vehicle, followed it about 50 yards into the woods, then lost it completely. They circled back, confused, unable to find the trail again. It was as if Margaret had simply ceased to exist at that spot. Divers checked the creek that ran parallel to the highway. The water was cold and murky, visibility near zero. They felt along the bottom with their hands, searching for anything that might explain what happened. They found nothing. By the third day, the crowd of volunteers had thinned. People had jobs to return to, families to care for. The initial surge of adrenaline had worn off, replaced by a grim acceptance that Margaret might not be found, at least not alive. Do you think they'll find anything? Comment below if you think they're close to discovering the truth. Jenkins sat in Sheriff Thompson's office, reviewing the case file. The physical evidence was minimal. Margaret's car had yielded no fingerprints other than her own. The ground around the vehicle showed no signs of a struggle. Her purse contained nothing unusual. The only thing missing was Margaret herself. What are we not seeing? Jenkins muttered to himself, spreading the witness statements across the desk. Thompson leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. You think someone took her? I think someone knows more than they're saying. Who? Jenkins didn't answer right away. His eyes scanned the list of party attendees again. 32 people, 32 potential witnesses, 32 people who might be hiding something. I need to talk to Ralph Haynes, Jenkins finally said. Thompson's expression shifted slightly. Ralph, he's a good man, runs the hardware store, goes to church every Sunday. I'm not accusing him of anything, but his name keeps coming up, and no one seems clear on where he was that night. The next morning, Jenkins drove to Haynes Hardware on Main Street. The store was quiet, just a few customers browsing the aisles. Ralph stood behind the counter, organizing receipts. He looked up when Jenkins entered, his smile polite but strained. Detective, what can I do for you? I need to ask you some questions about the night Margaret Walker disappeared. Ralph's smile faltered for just a moment before returning. Of course. Terrible thing. The whole town's been shaken up. You were at the Thompson farm party that night? I was. For a little while, anyway. I left early. What time? Maybe 10 o'clock. 10:30 at the latest. I had to be up early the next morning for a delivery. Did you see Margaret there? Ralph paused, his hand stilling on the receipts. I think so. Yes. She was there when I arrived, but I didn't talk to her much. We weren't close. Did you see her leave? No. Like I said, I left early. Jenkins watched Ralph's face carefully. There was something in his eyes, a flicker of discomfort, maybe guilt, or maybe just the normal unease of being questioned by police. Where did you go after you left the party? Home. My wife can confirm that. Jenkins wrote in his notebook. I'll need to speak with her. Of course. But when Jenkins interviewed Marie Haynes later that day, her answers were mechanical, rehearsed. Yes, Ralph had come home early. Yes, they had gone to bed. No, nothing unusual had happened. Jenkins didn't believe her. Not entirely. There was something in the way she avoided eye contact, the way her hands twisted in her lap as she spoke. But he had no evidence, no reason to push further. Not yet. Weeks passed, then months. The search parties stopped. The flyers faded in the sun. Life in Brooksville slowly returned to normal, though a shadow lingered over the town. Margaret Walker had become a ghost story, a cautionary tale parents told their children about staying safe. Linda refused to give up. She called the police station every week, asking if there were any updates. She kept Margaret's room exactly as it had been, clothes hanging in the closet, books stacked on the nightstand. She couldn't let go, wouldn't let go. Jenkins kept the case file on his desk, reviewing it during quiet moments. He knew the answer was there somewhere, hidden in the details, but the harder he looked, the more elusive it became. Then, 1 year after Margaret's disappearance, an anonymous letter arrived at the police station. Postmarked 1958. The handwriting was hurried, almost frantic. It contained only one sentence. Ask about the man who drove past her that night and the lie he told his wife. Jenkins read the letter 3 times, his pulse quickening. This was it, the breakthrough he had been waiting for. But who sent it? And more importantly, who was the man? The letter was brief but chilling. Ask about the man who drove past her that night and the lie he told his wife. Detective Jenkins knew this was no coincidence. The man in question, Ralph Haynes, had been seen near the scene. But why had no one mentioned him before? Jenkins sat alone in his office, the anonymous letter spread out before him under the yellow glow of his desk lamp. The handwriting was hurried, uneven, written by someone who wanted to talk but was too afraid to be identified. The postmark read, March 1958, exactly 1 year and 4 months after Margaret's disappearance. Someone had been carrying this secret, someone had waited, and now they had finally broken their silence. Jenkins picked up the phone and called Sheriff Thompson. I need everything we have on Ralph Haynes, everything. Within the hour, Thompson arrived with the original case files. They spread the documents across Jenkins' desk, witness statements, interview notes, timeline reconstructions. Jenkins began reading, his eyes scanning each page with renewed focus. And then he found it. Page 17. A statement from a witness named Dorothy Brennan, taken 3 days after Margaret's disappearance. Jenkins read it aloud. I was driving home from my sister's house around midnight. I saw Ralph Haynes's truck on Highway 47, near where they found Margaret's car. He was pulled over on the shoulder. I thought maybe he had engine trouble, but when I slowed down to ask if he needed help, he waved me off and drove away quickly. Jenkins looked up at Thompson. Why wasn't this followed up on? Thompson shifted uncomfortably. Ralph said he stopped to check his tire. We had no reason to doubt him. He's a respected man in this town. Respected men can be guilty too. Jenkins pulled out his own notes from his interview with Ralph a year earlier. Ralph had said he left the Thompson farm party around 10 o'clock and went straight home. But Dorothy Brennan saw him on Highway 47 at midnight, the exact area where Margaret's car was found, at the exact time she would have been driving through. Ralph had lied. The question was, why? Jenkins drove back to Haynes Hardware the next morning. The store was busier this time, customers picking up supplies for spring planting. Ralph stood behind the counter, ringing up purchases, chatting pleasantly with neighbors. He looked up when Jenkins entered, and for just a split second, his expression faltered. A detective, back again? Need a few more minutes of your time, Ralph. Of course, let me just finish up here. Jenkins waited, watching Ralph interact with customers. The man was smooth, comfortable in his role as the friendly local businessman. Everyone trusted him. Everyone liked him, which made what Jenkins was about to do even harder. When the store finally cleared, Jenkins approached the counter. "You told me you went straight home after leaving the Thompson party, that you got home around 10:30. "That's right. Then why were you on Highway 47 at midnight?" Ralph's face went pale. His mouth opened, then closed. His hands gripped the edge of the counter. I don't know what you're talking about. A witness saw your truck, pulled over on the shoulder right near where Margaret's car was found." Ralph's breathing quickened. He looked toward the door as if considering running, but he didn't. Instead, he straightened up, trying to regain composure. "I stopped to check my tire. I told you that already." "No, you didn't. You told me you went straight home. Now you're saying you stopped to check your tire. Which is it, Ralph?" The silence stretched between them. Ralph's jaw tightened. "I want to talk to a lawyer." Jenkins nodded slowly. "That's your right. But let me tell you something, Ralph. I've been doing this a long time. And when innocent people get questioned, they don't lawyer up over checking a tire. They explain themselves. They want to help. But guilty people, they hide behind lawyers." "I didn't do anything." "Then why did you lie?" Ralph didn't answer. He just stared at Jenkins, his eyes hard and defensive. Jenkins left the store but didn't go far. He parked across the street and watched. Within 10 minutes, Ralph locked up the shop and drove home. Jenkins followed at a distance. The Haynes residence was a modest house on Elm Street, white with green shutters and a well-maintained lawn. Marie Haynes was in the garden, tending to early spring flowers. She looked up when Ralph's truck pulled into the driveway, and even from a distance Jenkins could see the tension in her body language. Ralph got out of the truck and walked quickly to his wife. They spoke in hushed tones. Marie shook her head repeatedly, her hands gesturing in what looked like frustration or fear. Ralph grabbed her arm, not violently but firmly, and guided her inside the house. Jenkins made a note. Whatever was happening between Ralph and Marie, it wasn't a normal conversation between husband and wife. That evening, Jenkins returned to the police station and pulled out every document related to Ralph Haynes. Birth records, property records, business licenses. He wanted to know everything about this man. What he found was unremarkable. Ralph had been born in Brooksville in 1920. He served briefly in World War II but was discharged early due to a knee injury. He returned home, married Marie in 1946, and opened his hardware store in 1948. He had no criminal record, no complaints, no red flags. But Jenkins knew that backgrounds could be deceiving. Some of the most dangerous people were the ones who blended in perfectly. He turned his attention back to the original case files, reading through every witness statement again. And that's when he noticed something else. George Miller, Ralph's childhood friend, had also been at the Thompson farm party. George had been interviewed once, briefly, and his statement was vague. He said he left around 11 o'clock, didn't see Margaret leave, didn't notice anything unusual. Jenkins pulled out a town directory and looked up George Miller's address. He lived on the outskirts of Brooksville, on a small farm inherited from his father. The next morning, Jenkins drove out to the Miller farm. George was working in his barn, repairing a tractor. He was a large man, broad-shouldered and weathered from years of farm work. He looked up when Jenkins approached, wiping grease from his hands. "Detective Jenkins, what brings you out here?" "Need to ask you about the night Margaret Walker disappeared." George's expression didn't change. "Already told the sheriff everything I know." "Tell me again." George sighed and leaned against the tractor. "I was at the party, left around 11, went home, went to bed, heard about Margaret the next day. Terrible thing." "Did you see Ralph Haynes that night?" A pause, just a fraction of a second, but Jenkins caught it. "Yeah, he was there." "Did you see him leave?" "No. Like I said, I left around 11. "Did Ralph ever talk to you about Margaret?" "Why would he?" "Just answer the question, George." George's jaw tightened. "No, he didn't." Jenkins studied him carefully. George was hiding something. He could see it in the way the man avoided eye contact, the way his shoulders tensed. "If you know something, George, now's the time to say it." I don't know anything. Jenkins left the farm but made another note. George Miller, childhood friend of Ralph Haynes, possible accomplice. Back at the station, Jenkins opened the case file one more time and reread Dorothy Brennan's statement. She had seen Ralph's truck at midnight. Ralph had lied about his timeline. And now George Miller was acting suspicious. The pieces were starting to come together, but Jenkins still didn't have enough for an arrest. He needed something concrete, a confession, physical evidence, a witness willing to testify. And then it hit him. Marie Haynes. She had been nervous during their first interview. She had lied to protect her husband. But what if she knew more than she was saying? What if Ralph had told her what really happened that night? Jenkins picked up the phone and dialed the Haynes residence. Marie answered on the third ring. "Mrs. Haynes, this is Detective Jenkins. I need to speak with you, alone." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "When?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock, at the station." "All right." Jenkins hung up and leaned back in his chair. Tomorrow he would get the truth, one way or another, because the letter had changed everything. And now Ralph Haynes couldn't hide anymore. Jenkins sits down for a tense interview with Ralph Haynes. The man has a reputation for being calm, controlled, but something about his story doesn't add up. "I was home with my wife that night," Ralph insists, but Jenkins doesn't believe him. The interrogation room at the Brooksville police station was small and windowless. A single table, 2 chairs, a recorder sitting between them, its reels turning slowly. Ralph Haynes sat across from Detective Jenkins, his hands folded on the table, his posture straight. He looked composed, almost relaxed. But Jenkins had been doing this long enough to recognize the signs. The slight twitch in Ralph's jaw, the way his fingers pressed too hard against each other, the bead of sweat forming at his temple despite the cool air. "Let's go over this one more time, Ralph," Jenkins said, his voice steady and measured. "The night of November 16th, 1957, you were at the Thompson farm party." "That's correct." "What time did you arrive?" "Around 7:30, maybe 8. "And what time did you leave?" Ralph hesitated for just a fraction of a second. 10 o'clock, maybe 10:15. "Where did you go after you left?" "Home. I went straight home." Jenkins leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving Ralph's face. "Your wife confirmed that?" "She did. You spoke to her yourself." "I did. And she said you came home around 10:30 and went to bed. Is that accurate?" "Yes." Jenkins opened a folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. He placed it on the table between them. "This is a statement from Dorothy Brennan. She says she saw your truck on Highway 47 around midnight, pulled over on the shoulder, right near where Margaret Walker's car was found 2 hours later." Ralph's face went rigid. His eyes dropped to the statement, then back to Jenkins. "She's mistaken." "Is she?" "Because she knows you, Ralph. She's lived in this town her whole life. She knows your truck. She even slowed down to see if you needed help, but you waved her off and drove away. I don't know what she thinks she saw, but it wasn't me." "Then who was it?" "I don't know. Maybe someone with a similar truck." Jenkins pulled out another document. "I checked the vehicle registrations for Brooksville and the surrounding counties. There are only 3 trucks that match the description of yours. A 1955 Chevrolet, dark green, with a dent on the passenger side door. One belongs to you. One belongs to a farmer 10 miles south who was at home with his family that night. And one belongs to a man who sold his truck 2 months before Margaret disappeared. So tell me, Ralph, if it wasn't you Dorothy saw, then who was it?" Ralph's hands tightened. "I'm telling you, I wasn't there." "Then where were you?" "Home, with Marie." Jenkins stood and walked to the corner of the room, letting the silence stretch. He had learned over the years that silence was often more effective than questions. It made people nervous, made them want to fill the void with explanations, justifications, lies. Ralph shifted in his chair. "Am I under arrest?" "Not yet." "Then I can leave." "You can. But let me ask you something first, Ralph. If you're innocent, why are you so desperate to get out of this room?" Ralph stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Because you're accusing me of something I didn't do." "I haven't accused you of anything, I'm just asking questions, but the more you refuse to answer them, the more suspicious it looks." Ralph headed for the door, then stopped. He turned back, his face flushed with anger. "You want to know why I was on Highway 47 that night? Fine. I stopped to check my tire. I thought I had a flat. I pulled over, got out, looked at it, realized it was fine, and drove home. That's all. There's no mystery here, Detective. I didn't see Margaret, I didn't talk to Margaret. I had nothing to do with whatever happened to her." Jenkins watched him carefully. "Why didn't you tell me that from the beginning?" "Because I didn't think it mattered, and because I knew how it would look. It looks worse now that you've been lying about it for over a year." Ralph opened the door and walked out without another word. Jenkins sat back down and stared at the recorder, still turning on the table. Ralph's explanation was plausible. Barely. But it didn't explain the inconsistencies. It didn't explain why he had changed his story multiple times. And it didn't explain the fear Jenkins had seen in Marie Haynes's eyes. The next morning, Marie arrived at the station exactly at 10 o'clock. She wore a simple dress and a cardigan, her hair pulled back in a neat bun. She looked older than her 32 years, worn down by something Jenkins couldn't quite identify. Fear, maybe, or guilt. Jenkins led her to a different room. Not the interrogation room, but a quieter space with a window and softer lighting. He wanted her to feel comfortable, safe. He needed her to talk. "Thank you for coming, Mrs. Haynes." Marie nodded but didn't speak. "I want you to know that anything you tell me stays between us. I'm not trying to get you in trouble. I'm just trying to find out what happened to Margaret Walker." Marie's hands twisted in her lap. "I don't know what happened to her." "But you know something, don't you?" Her eyes filled with tears. She looked away, toward the window, as if she could escape through it. "Ralph is a good man," she said quietly. "He works hard. He takes care of me. He goes to church. He helps people in this town." "I'm sure he does. But he's been different since that night. Distant. He doesn't sleep well. He wakes up in the middle of the night and just sits in the living room staring at nothing." Jenkins leaned forward. "Marie, did Ralph tell you something about that night? Something he hasn't told anyone else?" Marie was silent for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "He came home late. Much later than 10:30. It was past 1 in the morning when I heard the truck pull into the driveway. I was awake, worried about where he was. When he came inside, his clothes were dirty. There was mud on his boots. And he wouldn't look at me." "Did you ask him where he'd been?" "I did. He said he'd been helping someone with their car, that they'd broken down on the side of the road and needed a hand, but he wouldn't tell me who it was. And when I pressed him, he got angry, told me to stop asking questions." Jenkins' pulse quickened. "Did he say anything else?" Marie's tears spilled over. "A few days later, after they found Margaret's car, he told me that if anyone asked, I needed to say he came home at 10:30. He said it was important, that people would get the wrong idea if they knew he was out late. And you lied for him. I'm his wife. What was I supposed to do?" Jenkins reached across the table and placed a hand on hers. "You're doing the right thing now, Marie. You're telling the truth." "But what if I'm wrong? What if he really was just helping someone?" "Then he has nothing to worry about. But if he's not telling the truth, then he needs to be held accountable." Marie pulled her hand back and wiped her eyes. "I don't want to believe he could hurt anyone. But I also can't ignore what I saw. The mud, the fear in his eyes, the way he's been living with this secret for over a year." Jenkins stood. "Thank you, Marie. You've been very helpful." After Marie left, Jenkins returned to his office and pulled out the case file once more. He now had 3 critical pieces of information. Dorothy Brennan saw Ralph's truck at midnight. Ralph came home after 1 in the morning with mud on his clothes, and Ralph had instructed his wife to lie about his whereabouts. But it still wasn't enough for an arrest. He needed physical evidence. He needed to place Ralph at the exact location where Margaret disappeared, and he needed to figure out what happened during those 3 missing hours. Jenkins picked up the phone and called the State Crime Lab. "I need a team out here. I want to search Ralph Haynes's property, his truck, his house, everything. What are we looking for? Anything that connects him to Margaret Walker, anything that proves he was lying. The search warrant was approved 2 days later. Jenkins arrived at the Haynes residence with Sheriff Thompson and 3 officers. Ralph stood on his porch, arms crossed, watching as they approached. "This is harassment," Ralph said. "This is a lawful search, Ralph. You can cooperate or you can make this harder on yourself." Ralph didn't move. He just watched as the officers entered his house, going through drawers, closets, storage bins. They searched the truck next, examining the interior, the bed, under the seats. And then, one of the officers found something. In the truck bed, beneath a tarp and a pile of old tools, was a length of rope. It was stained, darkened by something that could have been oil, or dirt, or blood. Jenkins pulled on gloves and carefully lifted the rope. He turned to Ralph, whose face had gone completely white. "What's this, Ralph?" "It's just rope. I use it for work." "Why is it hidden under a tarp?" "It's not hidden. It's just stored there." Jenkins bagged the rope as evidence and handed it to one of the officers. "Take this to the lab. I want it tested for everything." Ralph's composure finally cracked. "You're not going to find anything, because there's nothing to find." But as Jenkins walked back to his car, he knew the truth was getting closer. Ralph Haynes was lying, and soon those lies would catch up to him. With the case growing colder, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source: DNA testing. The remains found in 1962 were tested, and the results confirmed that they were indeed Margaret's. The case was no longer just a missing persons case. It was now a homicide investigation. 25 years had passed since Margaret Walker disappeared. A quarter-century of silence, of unanswered questions, of a family living in limbo, never knowing whether to grieve or to hope. Detective Jenkins had retired in 1975, but the case never left him. Even in retirement, he kept a copy of the file in his home office, reviewing it during sleepless nights. Ralph Haynes continued to run his hardware store. Marie stayed by his side, though those who knew her said she had grown quieter over the years, more withdrawn. George Miller worked his farm, and Linda Walker aged with the weight of her sister's disappearance pressing down on her like a stone. But in 1982, something changed. A hiker discovered human remains in a wooded area, approximately 8 miles from where Margaret's car had been abandoned. The bones were scattered, partially buried beneath decades of leaves and soil. Local authorities were called. The remains were carefully excavated and transported to the county coroner. Initial examination suggested the remains had been there for many years, possibly dating back to the late 1950s. The skeletal structure indicated a young female, approximately 5 feet 4 inches tall. The approximate age at time of death, early 20s. Sheriff Thompson, now in his 60s but still serving Brooksville, immediately thought of Margaret Walker. Jenkins received the call at his home on a Tuesday afternoon. Thompson's voice was steady, but carried an undercurrent of something Jenkins hadn't heard in years: hope. "Carl, we found remains. Female. The right age. The right time period." Jenkins felt his chest tighten. "Where?" 8 miles east of Highway 47, deep in the woods. A hiker stumbled on them by accident. "How long?" "Coroner estimates 20 to 30 years. Maybe longer." Jenkins closed his eyes. "It's her." "We don't know that yet. It's her, Frank. I can feel it." But feeling wasn't enough. They needed proof. In 1982, forensic science was advancing rapidly. DNA testing was still in its early stages, but mitochondrial DNA analysis, a method that could trace maternal lineage, was beginning to be used in criminal investigations. The technology was expensive and not widely available, but for a case like this, the state agreed to fund the testing. Linda Walker was contacted and asked to provide a DNA sample. She agreed immediately, though her hands shook as the technician swabbed the inside of her cheek. "Is it really her?" Linda asked, her voice breaking. "We won't know for certain until the tests come back," Thompson said gently. "But we're hopeful." The samples were sent to a laboratory in Columbus. The wait was agonizing. Weeks turned into months as scientists worked to extract usable DNA from bone material that had been exposed to the elements for over 2 decades. Finally, in early 1983, the results came back. The mitochondrial DNA was a match. The remains belonged to Margaret Walker. Jenkins sat in his living room when Thompson called with the news. He didn't speak for a long moment, just held the phone against his ear, processing what he had waited 26 years to hear. "We found her," Thompson said quietly. "Yes," Jenkins replied, his voice thick. "We did." But finding Margaret's remains brought a new, terrible reality into focus. This was no longer a missing person case. Margaret Walker hadn't run away. She hadn't started a new life somewhere else. She had been taken from her family, her life stolen, and her body hidden in the woods like she was nothing. Someone had done this to her, and that someone had been living freely in Brooksville for 26 years. Linda received the news at her home. She had never married, never moved away from Brooksville. Her life had been suspended in 1957, waiting for answers that had finally arrived. When Sheriff Thompson told her the remains were Margaret's, Linda didn't cry. She just nodded slowly, as if confirming something she had always known deep down. "At least now we know," she said. "At least now we can bring her home." A small funeral was held 2 weeks later. The casket was closed. There was nothing left to view after so many years. But the church was full. Teachers from the school Margaret had worked at, now elderly themselves, attended. Former students, now middle-aged with children of their own, came to pay their respects. And Ralph Haynes sat in the back row, his face expressionless, his hands folded in his lap. Jenkins attended the funeral, though he stood in the back, watching. His eyes never left Ralph. After the service, Jenkins approached Thompson outside the church. "We need to reopen the investigation, officially. With what evidence? The remains don't tell us who did this. No. But they tell us when and where. And we have witnesses who placed Ralph near the scene. We have his wife's statement that he came home late with mud on his clothes. We have the rope we found in his truck. The rope tested negative for blood. Because it had been cleaned, or because we didn't test it properly with the technology we had in 1958, but we can test it again now. We have better methods." Thompson sighed. "Carl, you're retired. This isn't your case anymore. Then make it my case. Bring me back as a consultant. Because whoever did this is still out there, Frank, and they think they got away with it." Thompson agreed. Jenkins was officially brought back as a consultant to the Brooksville Police Department. The case was reopened as a homicide investigation, and Jenkins threw himself into it with renewed energy. He started by re-examining all the physical evidence that had been collected in 1957 and 1958. The rope from Ralph's truck was sent to the state crime lab for advanced testing. Soil samples from the area where Margaret's remains were found were compared to soil samples from Ralph's property and truck. The results came back within weeks. The soil composition matched. The rope, while clean of blood, showed microscopic fiber evidence consistent with fabric from the 1950s, specifically a blue cotton blend similar to the dress Margaret had been wearing the night she disappeared. It wasn't definitive proof, but it was enough to warrant further investigation. Jenkins decided it was time to confront Ralph again. But first he needed to understand what had happened in the years since their last interview. He began asking around town, quietly, about Ralph's behavior, his relationships, his state of mind. And that's when he learned something unexpected. A woman named Helen Porter, who had worked as a secretary at the county courthouse, approached Jenkins at a diner one afternoon. She was in her 70s now, retired, but she remembered something that had been bothering her for years. "Detective Jenkins," she said, sliding into the booth across from him, "I heard you reopened the Walker case." "That's right. I think there's something you should know. Back in 1965, Ralph Haynes came into the courthouse. He wanted to file something, but then changed his mind. I saw him writing at one of the tables in the waiting area. He was there for about an hour, writing furiously, and then he just got up and left. He forgot to take the papers with him." Jenkins leaned forward. "What papers?" "I don't know. I put them in the lost and found, but no one ever claimed them. Eventually they were filed away in storage. But I always wondered what he was writing. It seemed urgent, important." "Do you remember when this was?" 1965. Maybe early 1966, I can't be sure. And these papers, are they still in storage? I don't know. But if they are, they'd be in the basement archives at the courthouse. Jenkins went to the courthouse the next day. The basement archives were a mess, boxes stacked floor to ceiling, files dating back to the early 1900s, no organization system to speak of. But Jenkins was patient. He spent 3 days searching through boxes labeled 1965 and 1966, and then he found it. A manila envelope, yellowed with age, marked Lost and Found 1965. Inside were 3 handwritten pages, the ink faded but still legible. Jenkins began to read and his blood ran cold. The letter was addressed to no one in particular. It was a confession. "I can't live with this anymore," it began. "What I did to Margaret Walker has haunted me every day since. I thought I could bury it, forget it, move on. But I can't. She deserved better. Her family deserved better." The letter went on to describe the night of November 16, 1957. How Ralph had left the Thompson party and seen Margaret's car on Highway 47. How he had pulled over to talk to her. How an argument had started. About what, the letter didn't specify. How things had escalated. How Margaret had ended up dead. "I panicked," the letter continued. "I didn't mean for it to happen. But once it did, I couldn't undo it. I couldn't bring her back. So I hid her, and I've been hiding ever since." The letter ended abruptly, as if Ralph had been interrupted or lost his nerve. Jenkins sat in the dusty basement, holding the pages with trembling hands. This was it, the proof he had been searching for. Ralph Haynes had confessed, not to the police, not to a priest, but to himself, and then he had walked away, unable to follow through. But why? Why write a confession only to abandon it? Jenkins suspected the answer. Guilt and fear were fighting inside Ralph. The guilt drove him to confess. The fear stopped him from going through with it. But now, nearly 20 years later, that confession had been found, and Ralph Haynes would finally have to face what he had done. After years of hiding the truth, Ralph finally confesses, but the confession raises even more questions. Why did he kill Margaret? What had driven him to this dark point? Detective Jenkins arrived at Ralph Haynes's hardware store on a grey morning in March 1983. He carried the yellowed pages in a manila folder, protected in clear evidence bags. 26 years had passed since Margaret Walker disappeared. 18 years since Ralph had written his confession and abandoned it at the courthouse. And now, finally, the truth was about to come out. Ralph was behind the counter when Jenkins walked in. He looked up, and the color drained from his face. He knew. Somehow, he knew. "We need to talk, Ralph." Ralph's hands stilled on the cash register. "About what?" Jenkins placed the folder on the counter between them. "About what you wrote in 1965. Ralph stared at the folder but didn't move. His breathing became shallow. His fingers gripped the edge of the counter until his knuckles turned white. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do. You went to the courthouse. You sat down. You wrote 3 pages confessing to the murder of Margaret Walker, and then you walked away." Ralph's jaw trembled. He looked around the empty store as if searching for an escape route that didn't exist. "I need you to come with me to the station," Jenkins said quietly. "We can do this the easy way, or we can do it the hard way, your choice." Ralph closed his eyes. When he opened them again, they were filled with tears. "I'll come." The interrogation room was the same one Jenkins had used 25 years earlier. Same table, same chairs, same recorder, though the technology had been updated. Ralph sat across from Jenkins, his shoulders slumped, his hands clasped together on the table. Jenkins turned on the recorder. "This is Detective Carl Jenkins. March 18, 1983. Interview with Ralph Haynes regarding the homicide of Margaret Walker. Ralph, you understand why you're here?" "Yes." "And you understand you have the right to an attorney?" "I don't want an attorney. I just want this to be over." Jenkins opened the folder and placed the 3 pages on the table. "You wrote this confession in 1965. Is this your handwriting?" Ralph looked at the pages. A tear rolled down his cheek. "Yes." "Did you kill Margaret Walker?" The silence that followed was suffocating. Ralph's breathing became ragged, his shoulders shook, and then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said the words that would finally close the case. Yes, I killed her. Jenkins felt the weight of those words settle over the room. 26 years of searching, 26 years of questions, and now, finally, an answer. Tell me what happened that night. Ralph wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. When he spoke, his voice was broken, fractured by guilt and exhaustion. I left the Thompson party around 10. I was driving home on Highway 47 when I saw Margaret's car ahead of me. She was driving slowly, like she was lost or confused. I thought maybe something was wrong, so I followed her. When she pulled over, I pulled over behind her. Why did she pull over? I don't know. Maybe she thought I needed help. Maybe she recognized my truck. I got out and walked up to her car. She rolled down her window and asked if everything was okay. I told her I was fine, just wanted to make sure she was safe. Ralph paused, his hands trembling. And then, Jenkins prompted. We talked for a few minutes, just small talk, but then I said something, I don't even remember what, and she got upset. She told me I needed to leave her alone. She started rolling up her window, and I grabbed her arm. Ralph's voice broke. I didn't mean to hurt her, I just wanted her to listen. But she panicked. She tried to pull away. She opened the door and got out of the car, and we struggled. She was screaming, telling me to let go, and I couldn't let her leave. I couldn't let her tell people what I'd done. What had you done, Ralph? Ralph looked up, his eyes red and hollow. I'd been watching her. For months. I was obsessed with her. I'd drive past her house, I'd wait outside the school where she worked. I knew it was wrong, but I couldn't stop. And that night, when she rejected me, when she looked at me like I was some kind of monster, I just lost control. Jenkins kept his voice steady, though anger burned in his chest. What happened after you grabbed her? She fell, hit her head on the side of her car. She wasn't moving. I checked for a pulse, but there was nothing. She was gone. And then what? I panicked. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't call for help. I couldn't tell anyone what had happened. So I put her in my truck. I drove her into the woods, and I buried her. Where in the woods? About 8 miles east. There's a clearing deep in the trees. I knew the area because I used to hunt there. I buried her as deep as I could, and then I drove back to her car, left it running with the door open, hoping people would think she'd just wandered off. Jenkins leaned forward. And your wife? Did she know? Ralph nodded slowly. She knew something was wrong. When I got home that night, I was covered in dirt. My clothes were torn. She asked me what happened, and I told her I'd had an accident, that I'd hit a deer and had to bury it. She didn't believe me, but she didn't push. Not then. When did you tell her the truth? A few months later. The guilt was eating me alive. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. I told her everything. And I begged her to keep the secret. I told her that if anyone found out, it would destroy both of us. And she agreed. She didn't want to, but she loved me. Or at least, she loved who she thought I was. So she stayed quiet. Jenkins sat back, processing everything Ralph had said. The confession was complete, detailed, believable. But there was still something missing. Ralph, in your written confession from 1965, you mentioned that someone helped you. Who was it? Ralph's face went pale. I didn't say that. Jenkins pulled out the 3rd page and pointed to a line near the bottom. Right here. You wrote, I couldn't have done it alone. George helped me cover it up. Ralph closed his eyes and shook his head. I shouldn't have written that. But you did. And now I need you to tell me the truth. Did George Miller help you? The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Finally, Ralph nodded. Yes, George helped me. The revelation hit Jenkins like a physical blow. George Miller, Ralph's childhood friend, the man who had been interviewed multiple times and claimed to know nothing. What did George do? He helped me move the body. I called him that night after I'd hidden Margaret's car. I was falling apart. I didn't know what to do. George came and helped me carry her deeper into the woods. He helped me dig, and then he swore he'd never tell anyone. And he kept that promise for 26 years. Yes, Jenkins turned off the recorder and stood. "Ralph Haynes, you're under arrest for the murder of Margaret Walker." Ralph didn't resist. He simply stood, held out his hands for the cuffs, and allowed himself to be led away. Word of Ralph's confession spread through Brooksville like wildfire. The man who had been a pillar of the community, trusted, respected, liked, was a murderer. The hardware store was closed. Marie Haynes moved out of town the next day, unable to face the judgment and horror of her neighbors. Linda Walker received the news at home. Sheriff Thompson sat with her in her living room, explaining everything Ralph had confessed. Linda listened in silence, her face expressionless. When Thompson finished, she simply nodded. "I always knew it was him," she said quietly. "I just couldn't prove it." "How did you know?" "The way he looked at me at Margaret's funeral, like he was sorry, like he was guilty. I saw it in his eyes even back then." But the confession also raised a new, terrible question. If George Miller had helped Ralph cover up the crime, what else had he done? And why had he stayed silent for so long? Jenkins knew that Ralph's arrest was only the beginning. There was still one more person who needed to answer for what happened to Margaret Walker, and that person was about to be confronted with the truth. The accomplice was revealed to be none other than George Miller, Ralph's childhood friend. George had helped Ralph bury Margaret's body and cover up the crime. Together, they kept the secret for decades. Detective Jenkins and Sheriff Thompson drove out to the Miller farm the morning after Ralph's confession. The sun was barely up, casting long shadows across the fields. George was in his barn, feeding livestock, when the two men approached. He looked up, saw their faces, and immediately knew why they were there. "George Miller," Jenkins said, his voice firm, "we need you to come with us." George set down the bucket of feed he was holding. His hands were steady, but his eyes betrayed him, wide with fear, darting between Jenkins and Thompson as if calculating whether he could run. "What's this about?" "Ralph Haynes confessed yesterday. He told us everything, including your involvement." George's face went rigid. For a moment, he said nothing. Then slowly he nodded. "I knew this day would come eventually." "Then you won't resist?" "No. I'm tired of running from it." George was arrested and taken to the station. Like Ralph, he waived his right to an attorney. He wanted to confess. He wanted it over. In the interrogation room, George sat across from Jenkins, his large frame seeming smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of what he had carried for 26 years. "Tell me what happened the night Margaret Walker was killed," Jenkins said. George rubbed his face with both hands. "Ralph called me around 2 in the morning. He was hysterical. Said he'd done something terrible and needed help. I'd never heard him sound like that before. Panicked, desperate. So I got dressed and drove out to where he was." "Where was he?" "On a dirt road off Highway 47. His truck was parked there, and Margaret's body was in the back, wrapped in a tarp." Jenkins' jaw tightened, but he kept his voice level. "What did Ralph tell you?" "He said it was an accident, that they'd argued and she'd fallen. He kept saying he didn't mean for it to happen. He was crying, shaking. I didn't know what to do. I should have called the police right then, but Ralph was my oldest friend. We grew up together, and he was begging me to help him." "So you did?" George nodded, shame etched into every line of his face. "We drove deeper into the woods, found a clearing Ralph knew from hunting. We buried her there. It took hours. By the time we finished, the sun was starting to come up." "And then what?" "Ralph drove her car back to Highway 47 and left it there with the engine running. Made it look like she'd disappeared on her own. Then we both went home and pretended nothing had happened." "Did you ever think about coming forward?" George's eyes filled with tears. "Every single day. But the longer I stayed quiet, the harder it became. If I'd spoken up a week later, maybe I could have claimed I was scared. But a year later, 5 years, 10, I was as guilty as Ralph by then. I'd helped him. I'd lied to police. I'd watched Margaret's family suffer and said nothing." Jenkins leaned forward. "Why are you confessing now?" "Because I can't carry it anymore. It's been eating me alive for 26 years. Every time I saw Linda Walker in town, every time someone mentioned Margaret's name, it felt like a knife in my chest. I deserve whatever punishment I get." George's confession was complete. He provided details that corroborated everything Ralph had said: the location of the burial site, the method they used to move the body, the lies they told their families. 2 men, 2 confessions. 26 years of silence finally broken. The arrests sent shockwaves through Brooksville. Ralph Haynes and George Miller, 2 men the town had known and trusted for decades, were murderers. Parents who had bought supplies from Ralph's hardware store felt sick. Neighbors who had borrowed tools from George couldn't reconcile the friendly farmer they knew with the man who had helped bury a young woman's body. The trial began 6 months later, in the fall of 1983. The courthouse was packed every day. Reporters from across Ohio filled the gallery. Linda Walker sat in the front row, flanked by her remaining family members, her face a mask of controlled grief and determination. The prosecution laid out the case methodically. They presented Ralph's written confession from 1965, his recorded confession from 1983, George's confession. The DNA evidence proving the remains were Margaret's, the soil samples matching Ralph's truck, the witness testimony placing Ralph at the scene. Ralph's defense attorney argued that the crime had been an accident, a tragic misunderstanding that spiraled out of control. He painted Ralph as a man consumed by guilt who had tried to confess multiple times but couldn't bring himself to face the consequences. George's attorney took a different approach. He argued that George had been an accessory after the fact, not a participant in the actual crime. That George had been manipulated by his friendship with Ralph, coerced into helping under extreme emotional duress. But the prosecution countered both arguments effectively. This wasn't an accident. Ralph had been obsessed with Margaret. He had stalked her for months, and when she rejected him, he had killed her to silence her. As for George, the prosecution argued that helping to bury a body and lying about it for 26 years went far beyond friendship. It was criminal conspiracy. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Witness after witness took the stand. Dorothy Brennan testified about seeing Ralph's truck that night. Marie Haynes, pale and trembling, admitted that she had lied to protect her husband. Sheriff Thompson described the decades-long investigation, and Linda Walker gave a victim impact statement that left the entire courtroom in tears. "My sister was 23 years old," Linda said, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "She was a teacher. She was kind. She was loved. And 2 men took her from us because one of them couldn't accept that she didn't want him, and the other was too cowardly to do the right thing. They let our family suffer for 26 years. They let us hope and search and grieve without closure. That's not friendship, that's not loyalty, that's cruelty." The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Ralph Haynes was found guilty of second-degree murder and obstruction of justice. He was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. George Miller was found guilty of accessory to murder after the fact, obstruction of justice, and tampering with evidence. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison. The courtroom erupted when the verdicts were read. Some people cheered, others wept. Ralph sat motionless, staring at the table in front of him. George dropped his head into his hands. Linda Walker stood and walked out of the courtroom without looking back. Outside, reporters swarmed her, asking how she felt, whether justice had been served, what she would do now. Linda stopped on the courthouse steps and turned to face them. "Justice has been served," she said quietly, "but it doesn't bring Margaret back. It doesn't give us the last 26 years. It doesn't erase the pain. All it does is confirm what we always suspected, that evil can wear a friendly face, that trust can be betrayed, that sometimes the people you think you know are hiding the darkest secrets." She paused, her eyes scanning the crowd of reporters and onlookers. Margaret deserved better. She deserved to live, to marry, to have children, to grow old, and those 2 men took that from her. So yes, I'm glad they'll spend the rest of their lives in prison, but it will never be enough. Linda turned and walked away, flanked by her family. The cameras followed her until she disappeared into a waiting car. Back in Brooksville, the town struggled to come to terms with what had happened. The hardware store remained closed, eventually sold to new owners who changed the name and tried to distance themselves from its history. The Miller farm was abandoned, the fields left fallow. Nobody wanted to buy property associated with such darkness. Families who had been friends with Ralph and George for decades found themselves questioning everything. How had they not seen it? How had two men carried such a terrible secret for so long without anyone noticing? The answer, Jenkins knew, was simple but uncomfortable. People see what they want to see. Ralph and George had been good at hiding. They had gone to church, helped their neighbors, maintained normal lives, and because of that, no one suspected them. But beneath the surface, guilt had been consuming them both. Ralph's abandoned confession proved that. George's tears during his interrogation proved that. They had both wanted to be caught, in a way. They had wanted the burden lifted. And now, finally, it was. Margaret Walker was buried beside her parents in the Brooksville cemetery. A new headstone was placed, white marble with her name, her dates, and a simple inscription, "Beloved daughter, sister, and teacher, forever in our hearts." Linda visited the grave every week for the rest of her life. She would sit beside the stone, talk to her sister, tell her about what was happening in town, update her on family news. It became her ritual, her way of keeping Margaret's memory alive. The case of Margaret Walker had finally been solved. The truth had come to light, justice had been served. But the scars remained. And Brooksville would never be the same. The case of Margaret Walker had finally been solved, but at what cost? The scars left on Brooksville would last long after the trial ended. Margaret's memory was honored, and justice was served, but the pain of losing her never fully healed for Linda and the rest of the town. 26 years. That's how long it took for the truth to surface. 26 years of questions, of sleepless nights, of a family torn apart by uncertainty, and when the answers finally came, they brought closure, but also a new kind of grief. Linda Walker was 62 years old when Ralph Haynes and George Miller were convicted. She had spent more than half her life searching for her sister, holding on to hope even when everyone else had moved on. The trial gave her what she had fought for, justice. But it couldn't give her back the years she lost. It couldn't undo the damage. "People ask me if I feel relief now that it's over," Linda said in an interview years after the trial. "And I do, in a way. But relief doesn't erase the anger. It doesn't make the pain go away. Margaret is still gone, and no prison sentence can bring her back." Detective Carl Jenkins retired for the second time after the convictions. He had dedicated decades to solving Margaret's case, and when it was finally closed, he felt both satisfaction and sorrow. He had brought justice to Margaret's family, but he also understood that justice came too late to truly heal the wounds. "Some cases stay with you," Jenkins reflected. "Margaret's case was one of them. I carried it with me every day, through my first retirement, through my years away from the force and back again. I'm glad we solved it, but I wish we'd solved it sooner." Brooksville struggled to recover from the revelations. The town had prided itself on being a safe, close-knit community where everyone knew everyone. But the trial exposed a darker reality, that trust could be weaponized, that evil could hide behind familiar faces, that secrets could fester for decades without anyone noticing. The hardware store where Ralph had worked was demolished in 1985. The Miller farm fell into disrepair and was eventually absorbed by neighboring properties. Physical reminders of the crime were erased, but the psychological impact remained. Families who had been close to Ralph and George found themselves ostracized, guilty by association. Children who had grown up playing with their kids were questioned, scrutinized, treated with suspicion. The ripple effects of the crime extended far beyond the two men who committed it. But slowly Brooksville began to heal. New families moved in, new businesses opened. Life continued, as it always does, even in the shadow of tragedy. Margaret's grave became a place of reflection, not just for her family, but for the entire community. People who had never met her would stop by, leave flowers, read her name on the headstone, and remember what had been taken from her. She became a symbol, not just of loss, but of resilience, of the fight for truth, of the refusal to forget. Linda continued to visit her sister's grave until her own death in 2001. She never married, never left Brooksville. Her life had been defined by Margaret's absence, and even when justice was served, that absence remained. Margaret was more than a victim, Linda said during her final interview in 1999. She was a person, a teacher, a sister, a friend. And I want people to remember that. Not just what happened to her, but who she was before it happened. The case of Margaret Walker serves as a reminder that cold cases are never truly cold. They live on in the hearts of those left behind, in the files of determined investigators, in the communities forever changed by loss. And sometimes, after decades of silence, the truth finally emerges. Ralph Haynes died in prison in 2003 at the age of 83. He never expressed remorse publicly, though prison records indicate he spent his final years in isolation, avoiding other inmates and refusing most visitors. George Miller served 15 years of his 20-year sentence before being released on parole in 1998. He moved to a different state, changed his name, and lived quietly until his death in 2007. Unlike Ralph, George reportedly expressed remorse multiple times, writing letters to Linda Walker asking for forgiveness. Linda never responded. Today, Brooksville is a different town. The generation that lived through Margaret's disappearance is mostly gone. New residents know the story only as local legend, a cautionary tale told in hushed tones. But for those who were there, who remember Margaret's smile and the horror of her loss, the memory remains sharp. Justice was served. The truth came to light. But some wounds never fully heal, and in Brooksville, Ohio, the name Margaret Walker will never be forgotten. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more cold case stories. The truth always comes out, but sometimes it takes longer than we expect.